They asked me here today to talk a little bit about Adventist history. So before you get bored and run out, how many know anything about Adventist history? Really know something about it? Any excitement? Yeah, one little hand up there. My man. So anyways, about 50 years ago now, because I'm getting old, I was on track to be a pastor. I went to Andrews University. But I was an introvert. I mean, a real wallflower, And I'm wondering to God, I said, man, I don't have any of the gifts because, you see, I evidently didn't believe God could fit me for what he called me for. But I said, God, I can't preach. I talk like I have a mouthful of rocks. I still do. I said, lead a song service? I can't sing. I sing so bad I hurt my feelings. I don't play an instrument. And I said, and besides, God, I'm an introvert now. Don't you have to like people too? No, it's not like I didn't like people, but introverts aren't people. If anybody is an introvert here, and I bet half of you are, you know what I mean. It's not like you don't like people, but you don't interface with them as well as other people do, right? And I had to learn that. So I ran away from my calling for 22 years. When I got back to Toledo, that's where I'm from, I got into selling carpet. The introvert is selling carpet now. And I did that on purpose so I could learn to tell my story, to get out there and talk to people. And I learned something important about selling carpet. You didn't have to know anything about carpet. People don't buy carpet from people who know about carpet. They buy stuff from people they like. It took me a couple of years to learn that. And that really helped to bring me out, learn to tell my story. I'm still an introvert, but I grew out of the closeness that I was in. So for 22 years, I'm running from God. And I want you to know, as I look back on those 22 years, he never left me. Like the hound of heaven, like the goodness of God. Your love is running after me. That's the hound of heaven. Relentless pursuit. He is after us. It's one of my favorite songs in our family, and I'm not doing this to elicit pity or anything. On January 31st, our 38-year-old son passed away. Unexpectedly, but not really. He was an alcoholic. He lived with us. I found him that Friday afternoon. And what we mourn is not so much the loss of what parents have lost, but what he had lost in an unrequited life, a life that he wasn't able to fulfill. And so when I think of this song, how can I have that kind of loss and still sing this song, Goodness of God? It's because we had committed him to the hands of the best one we could commit him to, who is a true and just God. And so we continue on. It's our faith that moves us along. It doesn't say there isn't shadow, because my wife and I, for the last 3 months, or at least 2 months, had been walking this valley of the shadow of death. We lost her dad within 5 weeks. They've been with us for 27 years, her dad and mother. So death is all around us. If you think this world is okay, when you lose people that close to you, the world gets a little darker. And so when I think as I begin to come back into church, it took me 10 years to do it. And I first started studying the doctrine, the Bible. I said, why Adventism? That was my question. People don't like it when you ask questions. Ask questions. You're never going to get an answer unless you're asking a question. Why Adventism? Why not the Baptist church down the street? And that's how I started. And then a little bit later, and this is our cue for today, I said, if God called this church, He called it in time and place. And if he did, we should probably know some of our history. And I started studying Adventist history. This is probably about 1987. And I got pretty good at it. I started at the beginning. Francis Nichols' book, The Midnight Cry, and the Millerite Movement. And I continued on. We moved out to Arizona in 93. I started selling cameras, Valley West Mall. And then I ran into a young lady there who worked with us. She said, "Oh, my pastor used to be a Seventh-day Adventist." And that was June of 1996. And I was introduced to the third thing of my study that would finally bring me back in. And that was called apologetics. If you're not familiar with apologetics, it's a field of study where you defend the faith. It comes from the Greek word apologia, which means to defend. And so that's where I was. Through doctrine, history, and apologetics. I came back in February of 98. I was rebaptized in May of 99. And in January of 2000, God laid into my hand a preaching and teaching ministry. So for 25 years, He's blessed me with that. My first sermon, Scottsdale Thunderbird Church. Of course, this wasn't here. We were right over there. A little group, all 10 or 12 of us. But that's where it began. And I remember the first sermon, time to take the point. We as Adventists have always seemed to be behind. We were the tail that wagged the dog. And it's time for us to get up front, because that's what God raised us up to be with this last great message that we're to give. And so it's through this, an Adventist central message, because of its history, that I'm an Adventist today, and I can't be anything else. And so today's message really is an origin story. It's not just a children's story about history. It's really a story about the birth of a movement and what God was doing when that happened. The birth here begins with William Miller. Now, William Miller lived up in Lowhampton. That's if you look along the border of Vermont, where it kind of nudges out and begins to follow the river, that's about where Lowhampton is. Directly across, almost within walking distance, in fact it is in those days, was Fairhaven. Not the Fairhaven of Joseph Bates, but Fairhaven of Vermont. And it was there that in his adulthood, when he met his wife Lucy from Vermont, he would go over to Fairhaven into the library and study the books. And this was right at the time of the Enlightenment, Voltaire and all the rest, and he became a deist. We know that later he had changed. When he came back home, he moved back to Lowhampton, built this classic house that we're all familiar with, and began to settle in. And by 1816, he had come back into Christianity. And by 1818, he knew that Jesus would come in about 25 years from where that time was, by studying Daniel and Revelation. So that was a birthing point that would develop into Seventh-day Adventism, why we're here today. But my question was there something that happened in our history before all this, back further in time, that was the first domino that you tip over that made it possible for us to actually be here? I knew Adventism always had the possibility, but what was the event that really put things into motion, even if it was unknown to the person that it happened to? And that's what we're going to talk about, 9/11 and Adventism. But the 9/11 isn't the 9/11 you might be thinking about. It's not about two planes flying into a building. It's a different 9/11 that we're going to look at. So Miller went out and did his preaching. And before he did that, God had to send him on that mission. Remember the movie that came out a few years ago? Tell the World. And I thought, well, that sounds kind of familiar. I'm thinking, are they meaning this particular thing? And when I watched the film, it was not. Tell the World was simply the message they gave at the end of the film when J.N. Andrews was our first official missionary overseas. And he was to go tell the world of the Advent message. But there was a book out there about William Miller called Tell It to the World. And that's the point we want to look at. I have a couple videos here. We're going to see if we can play them. He gave me the thumbs up. And here's the first video. He didn't guarantee sound. By the way, the actor here is my old Bible teacher from Delphine Academy, Gerald Rossmer. His sister goes to my church in Glendale. He's praying to God about what's happening with the message that he's given to be close, and he's contemplating how this message is going to go out. But that Saturday morning, God had come to him and told him, as he heard in the back of his head, the message, tell it to the world. All the things that he had studied about God, tell it to the world. And he's arguing with God. God, I'm just a farmer. You know, I don't know anything about that. I'm not a preacher. Give it to somebody else. God says, I have set you as a watchman over the house. He says, tell it to the world. And finally, William said this. Okay, Lord, if I get an invitation to preach, and second thing qualifier, and it's on what I've been studying in books of Daniel and Revelation, I'll go. Well, no one had asked him before. Why would they ask him now? So he instantly had peace, and he settled down at his desk to begin to study. And within 20 minutes, his nephew from the town of Dresden, 12 miles north, knocked on the door. He opened it up, talked to him, and the boy said, Father, who was the deacon, had told me the pastor won't be there tomorrow and asked if I would come to ask you if you would come preach. Okay, there's the first qualification, had to preach. Yeah, if you would preach on what you've been studying in Revelation and Daniel. Well, you think, William Miller's a believer in God. This guy'd been on his way before Miller prayed his prayer, made his deal with God. You think he'd jump up and say, hallelujah. This is a God thing, right? I mean, I know a God thing. You know, in the 25 years I've been preaching, all my appointments have been by invitation. I never asked to speak anywhere. And I've been speaking for 25 years. All of my appointments are divine appointments. You're not here by accident. You're not here because Karl's here. You're here because someone else sent Karl. And I got a message to tell you from the one who sent me. Not about me, but about him. No, he wasn't happy at all, the truth of the matter is. He was very upset. And he didn't say a word. And he turned out, this isn't his study. I've been in his home. And he walked out the door, and you make an immediate left. There's a small hall, takes you right out the back kitchen door. And that's where he walked. Now the barn, remember he was a pig farmer. The barn he would go to would be directly behind the house. And little Lucy, 4 years old, would follow him. So Dad goes out, Lucy follows. But Dad doesn't go straight, he steps off the side porch. And he goes across the yard, down into a ravine, and back up the other side into a maple grove. She was going to follow him to the barn, like she often did. But she stopped in amazement. Came back in the house and said, something's matter with Daddy. Well, something matter with Daddy was that God called him on what he had said. Don't make promises with God because he'll call you on it. And there he was in the maple grove, arguing with God once more. They said that the man who went in was a farmer, but the man who came out was a preacher. And that's how the message started. He went up to Dresden. They had 2 weeks of services. Came back home, was reinvited over to Pulteney, where he had been living after he married Lucy, and had another 2 weeks of revival. He was never without an appointment. Again, all by invitation. This is how God works. So if you want to test God, you know what side of the test you're going to be on. I took a trip recent. Anybody listened to the History Project with Matthew Lucio? Got one hand. No more? Go on YouTube, Spotify, whatever. Look up the History Project. Matthew Lucio will give you Adventist history, little short stories. Michael Campbell. Know Michael Campbell? Professor Campbell? He did the books 1922 and 1919. His dissertation was on the 1919 Bible Conference. He had a podcast on there he does with Greg Howell, and that's the Adventist Pilgrimage. Judd Lake did one on Ellen White for about a year, and I guess they're going to revamp that, and there'll be a new speaker there as well on Ellen White. But the Adventist podcast is where you can easily pick up Adventist history. You don't have to sit down and read a book if you're not a reader. And you can learn something about who we are and why God called us. It's not just history for history's sake, but it puts us in mind of the path God put this movement on. You know, we're first a movement, then a denomination. He called us with a message to give at this time in salvation history. So in the trip, we had found ourselves up in Maine. We went to a little town called Gorham. Anybody familiar with Gorham, Maine? This is where Ellen White was born. And so we drove down the street. You got this plaque up down here, this big stone plaque, looks like a headstone. And this is the area, the house across the road, well, it's just a piece of land now, was where she was supposed to have been born. But that wasn't the house she was born at. In fact, years ago, Michael, as a young boy, always been interested in history. He went over to the house after it burned down and got a bunch of the bricks from the foundation. He has about 23 bricks that he has collected of the base, foundation of Ellen White's home as a child. Then he come to find out, checking the records, Robert Harmon never bought the place. So it's not Ellen White's home, and he's got 23 bricks. So if you want a brick, give Michael a call, tell him Karl sent you. But anyway, we found she had one home in Gorham, Maine. It's this home. Now, to the left of the picture, down the road, is where the home was, we thought, where the marker is. You see that in a minute. And as we passed by, I'm in the van, one of those internationals, and I'm on the correct side of the seat. I turn around and I click that as we go by. They put siding on it, kept it up well. Where the lean-to used to be, you got a nice 2-car garage and a breezeway between it. But that's the house where she lived until about 6 or so when they moved into Portland, Maine, down the road. So there's her house. Now going back to the road, this is the plaque. Looks like it's on a headstone. And that's where we begin to tell the story. Across the street from that is where the one house was they thought they bought, but they didn't buy that. You know about Ellen coming home from school. You know that she was a twin? Elizabeth was her name. And they were coming home from the Brackett Street School. This is the building. Notice they're still using it. It's called the Fresh Approach. It's a bakery. It's a store. I bought my lunch there. It's nice the building's still being used. But that's the school. And we're across the street is a school that's built more modern school, and that's the Brackett Street School. But this was where Ellen was going. And on her way home with her sister, a 13-year-old, followed close behind. And she kept teasing and taunting Ellen. And finally, when Ellen turned around to see where she was, the girl had thrown a stone, and it hit her on the nose and the sinus and crushed it into her face. And that's where she was hit. I can relate. I was about the same age. I was 8, not 9. We lived on South Toledo on Maumee Avenue. And my twin and a neighborhood kid were going out to his house to the backyard when we heard a hoot owl hoot, which scared us to death. So we all came back and took pieces of stone from a wall, all jagged rocks. And we marched slowly to the backyard. And when it hooted again, all I remember is I was in the front yard reeling, and my nose was bleeding. I had 3 stitches put in there, and they must have put enough gauze up there to cover a mummy, because he just kept shoving it up there. I didn't know where it was going. I thought it was a magic trick. So if you look real hard, you can still see the scar. And that was a long time ago. So I can kind of appreciate what she went through. I didn't go through quite as bad as she did, but I understand what happened. You know? This is the place where their church was, and during the Millerite movement, they were supporting William Miller in the Second Coming. And now the churches were going against that. And so the family got kicked out because they wouldn't give up their belief in the Second Coming of Christ. Now, when that happened, this isn't the church. That church had been torn down. In fact, they had a fire in Boston. It took a lot of land. And July 4th, right after the Civil War, about 1865. And so a lot of that stuff had to be rebuilt. But it was in this spot. It was a Methodist church, just like this one is here. And her family was kicked out. Elizabeth was soured on that. She never again manifested any real interest in religion after that period. And Ellen would write to her over the years. She would send her one of her books. Every time she published a book, she would send her one. Lizzie had every single one of her books, but she never came around. Elizabeth had lost a child. We know that Ellen lost 2. Henry at 16, but before that, little baby John, just a few months old. So she knows what loss was. And she tried to appeal to her sister, let God put that baby back in your arm. So, but this was the church there in Boston, and in Portland. We went to the graveyard where her sister is, and she married a man named Bangs, Elizabeth Bangs. And if you can make it out, the date that says Elizabeth was born was November 18, 1826. Anybody see a problem with that? No? When was Ellen White born? She was born on November 26, 1827. So she was born a year after her sister, but they're twins. You know how it was in those days. They didn't have official birth certificates like we have. And Ellen been known to write her sister toward the end there and said, Elizabeth, just what is our birthday? Just when were we born? Now, Ellen White had filled out some sheets of information, and in there she put the November 26, 1827 date. But even Ellen wasn't quite sure what day it was. Maybe Elizabeth is right. Maybe they were born even later, in 28. We don't know. It can't be too much because she had Henry when she was pregnant at 19. And we don't want to make her too young giving birth to a baby boy. They already have enough stories about Ellen White to try to make her look bad. We don't want to add any more to it, you know. So they're not even 100% sure. That's a picture of both The girls were fraternal twins. So if you're looking for identity, they're not identical. I know how that works. I'm a twin. And thank God we're fraternal. We're brothers like any other brother or sister. And there aren't two of me walking around, so you're safe. So, and then we stopped at this cemetery. Can you see that? This stone tells the story of this man. If you know, who can read the name. The name says Hazen Foss. Anybody know who Hazen Foss is? Yeah, it says when he was born, when he died in 1893, early 70s. He was about 72 when he died. We had to cut some of the grass away just so we could take a picture. It was really dingy. And what I found striking was that this stone was so bad, almost put this guy, his own memory behind us. The stones next to it were much nicer looking of the family. You could read him. But his stone was so bad. I wish I had some water I could have poured on it. It would have helped make that relief come out a little better. So then we went up the road from there. We went up to Thompson, Maine. And this house right here, very important home. Now, this was the home of the Howland family. On August 26, 1847, Henry was born in Gorham, Maine. The year before, in 46, on August 30th, is when they got married, James and Ella. Bates had just written the Sabbath pamphlet, had given them the copy. They said, well, God will show us if it's so. They were still pushing for Sunday. We know that by that October of 46, they were Sabbatarian. And by the next year, they had moved out of the home because they had moved back with the family in Gorham. Evidently, the family moved back from Portland to Gorham, Maine. And then from there, they come out here. The Howlands were big supporters of theirs. And they lived upstairs here, not in the second floor, but in the attic above it. There was an unfinished attic. Now, this house was moved twice, which that is in the second place. This is where it was here. And it's across the street, straight back from the house, is where the house is now. Now, where it was the second time, I don't know. But the house was on that corner because there were two streets that came out and kind of rounded out as the other street passed by. And the house sat back here, and then they moved it across the street. But that's where they were. I show you the Clarissa Bonfoy's headstone because it was her family who had passed, her mother, and she got some furniture that she let the Whites use at the Howland home. And because the Whites were so poor, and that having a child now was really hindering them going into the field, that Clarissa stayed there, and she raised little Henry for 5 years. She was there with him. She ended up moving out with them to Rochester when they moved, and then from Rochester to Battle Creek in 55. Now, here is the family graveyard. You see the picture of it here. Ellen and James are up by that flag on the left, and you go down that road to the very end is where Clarissa is buried. Now, people talk about the baby being the first one in the family cemetery. No. The baby died December 63. So, what's at the end is Clarissa. She died in May of 56. And what happened is Ellen White had given a speech at a church there in town, at the Battle Creek Church. And you remember the speech. It's called Some for Worms. She says, some of you will be food for worms, and others will live to see Christ coming. And so Clarissa says, I won't live to see Christ coming. I will be food for worms. And within 30 days of hearing that presentation, he died. 35 years old. First one buried in the family plot. But she had given her life to having watched the children, not just little Henry, but as they moved across into Rochester and then into Michigan at Battle Creek by 1856. I talk about Ellen White and her important position we usually start talking about her books. And some of the books that we like to talk about outside of, say, Steps to Christ is the Conflict of the Ages series, right? You know, Patriarchs and Prophets, Prophets and Kings, Desire of Ages, you know. But what we're looking at here is probably, I think, more significant than anything she might have written. If all she did was this, she would have been God's messenger, and our church would have been okay. Coming out of the disappointment, she was the first to lead our church into publishing a newspaper. We became a publishing concern before we became a denomination, a religious denomination. We started in publishing. And not just a paper, but tracts and then later on books. She helped then when we got to Battle Creek to begin to organize church organization. Remember, the mindset at the time was that once you organize, you become Babylon. But she knew that gospel order was needed, and that we needed to organize to own property if we're going to continue to carry this message. She helped put that wheel on, church organization. After 2 weeks, May 1863, after the forming of the General Conference, she has her health vision about pork. Now, she had some stuff before to say about health, not smoking, drinking coffee and tea, but here was a major vision, and it really had to do with pork. And from that time until 1900, the issue of clean, unclean meats only settled on pork. That means you could eat anything you want. We just stayed away from pork. And we didn't do it for health, for religious reasons. It's for health reasons. As Ellen White wrote, pork is entirely unfit for food. It would turn of the century with the helps of Stephen Haskell that we brought the rest of Leviticus 11 into the picture. But when you read Ellen White's stories back in the 1800s, when James was sick, she made sure he had a squirrel a day. He needed it for health. You know? When they were out hunting, going across the Rockies, little Willie had his .22 rifle, killed himself a duck, and they had duck. You know? She was writing a letter to her niece. She was in California. Her niece was back east. When you come back to California, bring me some of those good oysters in the can. I want oysters from the East Coast and not these West Coast oysters. And she ate oysters. And that wasn't an issue at that time. You might hear people critique that, criticize, oh, Ellen White ate oysters, as if she was going against what she was saying. And that's not so. But she helped to bring the church to its understanding of health. And we developed the Health Institute by 1866. She put the third wheel on the movement. Then education. Right after we got the health thing going, a young man comes down to the Health Institute. His name is Goodloe Harper Bell. He's a teacher. And he came in to get some convalescence, to get his strength back. And he began a small school there with the boys. As the children of the pioneers were coming of age where they were working in the businesses like the Review and Herald, etc. They weren't going to school. And they asked him, hey, you're a teacher. Teach us. Give us some night classes. And so they organized a school. Down the street, they used the first Review building. They had been moved down the street. Harper lived on the first floor, and they taught the classes on the second. And so we began the education for real. And by 1874, we had a college, Battle Creek College. That college, by 1903, would move to Berrien Springs, Michigan. That becomes Emmanuel Missionary College. And by 1960, we know it as Andrews University. Then the same year, 1874, we opened up the missions, where we began to send missionaries out into the world. The first one being J.N. Andrews, there in 74, with his daughter Mary and his son Charles, is when they began to reach out. Ellen put the wheels on Adventism. If that's all she ever did, that would be enough. An Advent Christian pastor who was friends with Francis Nico, he's the editor of the SDA Bible Commentary, written a lot of books there in the 40s and 50s. The Advent Christian pastor says, you Adventists must be smarter than us, because we haven't grown very much. But you guys are really growing. Francis says, no, we're not any smarter. We just had this singular person in our midst who would tell us things, that would recommend things we should do, give us counsel, and we followed it. He's referring to Ellen White. That's why we're successful. He wasn't really happy to hear it. He kind of started talking about apple trees after that. But this is why we were successful. God used Ellen to help us grow into who we are. So, the two founders, James and Ellen, are united with the third founder, Joseph Bates. And Joseph Bates was born in Massachusetts. He was born in Rochester, Massachusetts, not Rochester, New York. And when he was very little, the family moved down to Fairhaven. Fairhaven at the time wasn't called Fairhaven. It was New Bedford. But it was on the east side of the river to come past. And what happened is the people on the east side of the river were more for separation from Britain, and those on the west side of New Bedford, they were Tories. They were the ones who wanted to stay with Great Britain. And finally, they did change the name of the town to Fairhaven. And that was a division between there. This is the house he lived in. When they first got there, there's a little bit of the house behind the front structure you see. You go back, was the original house that they moved into. This had been added, and the back section was added. And by the time Miller was living there, after his father passed, and he was sea captain, because the ocean was right here, and if you got rid of a lot of the houses there, he could see from his bedroom window the boats coming in to port, where he would dream about being a captain on the high seas. And so here was where he came from, and would come out of here, from there, to begin to spread the Sabbath message. He heard about it in a pamphlet by T.M. Preble, a Free Will Baptist, and so he left this house on foot and walked up to Washington, New Hampshire, on foot. I know the old movie from 1979, Keepers of the Flame, show him kind of riding in on a horse and jumping off gallantly in daytime and knocking on the door. Well, not as glamorous as that. He had to walk. And he didn't get there till about 10 o'clock at night. Woke everybody up. But he went up there to get the information about the Sabbath, which he did. And that was what he began to propagate. And so here is now a little sky picture of Atlantic Union College. Carlos is in here. He knows about it, Lancaster, Massachusetts, where the college is formed. And right up the road here a piece, if you go up that green road off the map and come back around, you're going to find another house where J.N. Andrews lived in for a short time before he went overseas. But here's the campus. This is the main building that was first built, and this was Haskell Hall. What happened is, at Battle Creek College, they had some issues, and they had to close the school for about a year. Excuse me. And in closing the school, they kind of, Goodlow Harper Bell, even though he wasn't the president, even Bell thought you needed somebody more trained to be the president of that school. But yet he was still involved in it. They said somebody pushed him down the stairs, no respect, and they closed the school. So Haskell comes back over here to Lancaster, and Bell goes with him. And they start a school. That would become South Lancaster Academy. Later on would be Atlantic Union College. And that's what we see here, is how this whole thing is blossoming out. By this time here, we're just a few years away from Atlantic Union College, Battle Creek College, Union College in Nebraska, Walla Walla College. All this was growing rapidly now. And this is the house that was up on Main Street from the college. As I said, went up and around the curve. This is where J.N. Andrews stayed. This was an interesting stop. We pulled up our two internationals. I didn't get out of the car or the vehicle. I asked Michael Campbell to take a few pictures of the house. My knee was blown out on the first day of the trip. They had us walking all over Boston Commons. Anybody been to Boston Commons? Yeah, a lot of big places where you're walking around. And my knee was shot. So I said, here, take some pictures. So the people are outside taking pictures, and a guy comes from that property, it's a house on the other side of that red house, and really giving us the riot act. Don't you guys read your own papers? This was supposed to be a place we couldn't even go to. Well, if you see where we were this picture is, we were up by those mailboxes even a little further. We weren't anywhere on his property. And we were there to tell the story, take a couple of pictures, and be on our way. But he really came out and gave us a hard time about being on his property. But that's just one side of the picture. Here's Jan Andrews. This is on the campus of Andrews. Him with his daughter Mary up front, and Charles. Read the story. Mary, a beautiful child, highly intelligent. When they got on the boat, she didn't know French. They had to learn French crossing the ocean. They had only 20 minutes a day they could speak English. All the rest of the time was French, so they could learn it. And when they got there, and he began writing the French signs of the times, he had a translator there who would translate it into French. But she began to do it sometime after that, and she did a better job. Why? Because she knew the French language better? No. She was an American. She knew how to take the culture of the English language and express it with the French language better than the guy who knew French. So she was able to carry the message over. I don't speak two languages. I play with Hebrew and Greek. I certainly don't speak it. But anybody here who speaks two languages knows most of the time, if not all the time, you're not translating word for word. You're translating the idea. It's called dynamic translation. And so you have to bring with it not just the words, but the message. The feeling and everything has to go with that. There's more than just translation. And so she was quite a dear. She died of tuberculosis at the age of 17, just 17. He had brought her back to Battle Creek College, and she died there. He contracted TB from her. He went back to Europe. Within a few months, he was dead. Charles stayed in Europe, became a pastor, and I guess he had a fine career there as a pastor. So people have given their life for the cause. I like Jan Andrews because he and I share the same month and date of birth. I'm a July 22nd. Just so happens my twin is the same day, unlike Ellen and her twin. So we visited over at Uriah Smith's home, after that we went to the cemetery, and we saw here where Rebecca's buried. In this picture to your right, down on the ground to the left is that little square stone. That's where Annie's buried. But family is all along there. To the far right, another little stone. Says father, then mother. She has a brother there. And so this is the family where they were buried. Annie was working for the Whites, editing. She was a fine editor. And she died very young of TB at 1855. Now, they were alive. The kids were there, her and her brother, during the Millerite movement. And they had a great experience, but a disappointment. And they kind of grew a little cool against the religion. And they started concentrating on their careers. They both, Uriah and Annie, could have been successful teachers, making some fine money in those days. But they chose instead to come work for God. Now, while Uriah was working on it, trying his career, she would reach out to him. He was quite artistic, and he could do engravings. So she got him to make the plaques for some of the things they were publishing, some of the wood engraving. And she kind of wooed him back in to the church. This is her home, which was a roadside inn. Samuel Smith, the dad, ran a bar, a tavern. with boarding rooms. And in fact, in Arizona, we were required to have within a certain distance a tavern like this, where people can stop for refreshment, have a place to feed the horses, and a place to sleep, so you can keep moving. This was one such thing. The family often didn't live in these buildings themselves. They maybe had rooms and buildings outside of them in the back they lived in, would come into this building to work. So the lady here, by the way, and this is the contrast to the guy that threw us off Jay and Andrew's property. She's not an Adventist. She, very old, hard to get around. She met us at the door and loved every single one of us and let all these Adventist strangers come into her house and trance around. And she began to share with us the story about different things. And that's just the difference between the graciousness that you run into. She was a lovely lady. She'd been doing this for about 20 years, maybe even more. So, yeah, we had a nice time. So Joseph Bates, where was I? So, 1844. Annie had an interesting, she embraced the doctrine of the soon coming of Christ. At 16, after 1844, she had lost interest. But what happened? She had a dream. And Joseph Bates had a dream. And Annie's mother was trying to get her back into, and even talked to Bates about it, trying to get the interest of her daughter, get her back in. Annie had the dream of a man preaching about the 2300 days. And Bates had a dream about a young lady coming in to the door as he was preaching. The room was full, and the only seat was by the door, and she took her seat there. And so when she came in to the meeting, that's exactly what happened. She saw what she saw. Joseph Bates saw what he saw in the dream. And he knew that was the one. And he changed what he was preaching and went immediately into the 2300 days. And this is how she came back into the movement. So Uriah Smith, he had the very same thing. He began to lose interest, was going to teach there at Phillips Exeter Academy, and he had a change of mind because of his sister's work. So by the time she died, he moved into the Rochester office and began to do editorial work. So that's the house, a very stately house. But again, it was a business. You see the plaque by the front door, it tells you that it was a historical tavern. So then over in the Finger Lakes area of New York, you have Lake Ontario up north, city of Rochester. That's where we begin to move our press. Because before we used to have the paper printed. We'd have to spec it out. But we got a printer, actually a machine that we could print our pictures, our newspaper with. And that was with the aid of, I had to stop thinking of his name there for a second, Everett. So in Rochester, they set up housekeeping, and they set up the printer. And south of them was a young man named Loughborough, who was a Sunday Adventist, who began preaching. And on the right-hand side is where Hiram Edson was living. And then another young man was joined him in that area from Massachusetts. He was from East Massachusetts. His name was Stephen Haskell. He came across. But in Rochester, young J. N. Andrews, was the main evangelist. And Loughborough was getting information from the people he was preaching to that the Sabbatarians have moved in, and you need to go out and set them straight. So Loughborough was going to go set them straight. He writes all the texts on his, I think it was on his arm, all the Bible texts about why we shouldn't keep the seventh-day Sabbath. And he wrote them all down. He got up to Rochester, sat down, Jan Andrews came out, and at the last second, he changed the sermon. He changed it to preaching on the Sabbath. And he began to use the very text Loughborough had. Not just the text, in the order that Loughborough wrote them down. And hence to say, Loughborough became an Adventist. So the movement's beginning to grow, and from here, from about 52 to 55, we end up moving over to Battle Creek. So William Miller, died in 49. He never did become a Seventh-day Adventist. So he had a letter written to him by Mr. Nichols, a big supporter of Ellen White, who tried to tell him about her gift. But he didn't. He'd been disappointed, and he did not want anything to do with that. But his main thing, and this gets to our main point, was the Battle of Plattsburgh, up the river, up there in Lake Champlain, when he was a young man. He was a captain of the militia. And when he got in the Army, they gave him a commission as a captain. His dad was a captain in the Revolutionary War. So here he is up at Plattsburgh, September 11th, 9/11. There's your 9/11 right there. He writes his wife that night, "The British are within 10 miles of this place," he says. "And we expect a battle tomorrow, and I think they must be," exclamation, "fools if they do not attack us, as they are 10 or 11,000 strong, and we are only 1,500. But every man is determined to do his duty." He says, "It may be my lot to fall, and if I do, I will fall bravely. But remember, you will never hear from me if I am a coward. I must close as it's almost 11 o'clock. He was in the area by the lake, and they had these 3 little forts, and they're not regular forts you would think of. They're really mounds of dirt that have guns over them, cannons, and then sides, and they're all open in the back. And there are 3 of them, and he's in the top middle one towards land called Fort Moreau. And there were 3 of them there. And that's where he was. So they had cannons they're shooting. You can see it right here. Cannons that were going to shoot out over the lake. The lake is behind us there, down at the bottom of the frame. What we see there is a Senecret River coming through. The British wanted to come around the river and come up the river to do the battle. They never quite made it that far. And so here's the lake. You can see the yellow line I drew is the British came from the north because the lake goes into Canada. So it's easy to build the boats and bring them right on down. And they come around to the bay of Plattsburgh. And that's where the battle took place. And this is an old map. I have an artist conception of this that was done, and even with the signature of the artist on it. It's a pretty big-sized map. I just got to find a place to hang it up on. And so we see the battle here. We see Fort Moreau. Above that is Fort Brown, and down at the bottom is Fort Scott. Those were the 3 forts. But the whole little peninsula there, it's not an island, it's a peninsula. It was used for military, storing weapons, arsenals, and things of that nature. So, Vermont and New York had been threatened from Lake Champlain because the British could come down, Vermont on one side, New York on the other. So the commander of the American squadron on this lake was entrusted to Commodore Thomas McDonald. The defense of Plattsburgh depended on the exertions of General Macomb. Macomb was head of the land forces, and his gallant little army, emphasis on little. In September 1814, an attack was anticipated on these youthful commanders accordingly, and on the 11th of that month, 9/11, the expected event took place. He says, for several days the enemy had been on their way down to Plattsburgh by land and water. It was well understood that an attack would be made at the same time by his land and naval forces. Commodore McDonald determined to wait at anchor the approach of the latter. He didn't take his boats and went up looking for him. He waited right there for them to show up. General Macomb was frequently advised to retreat, to spare the blood and lives of his quote unquote apology for an army. That's how little they were. And save Plattsburgh from the fate of a conquered country. But the decision which he took, and to which he unwaveringly adhered, in his apparent forlorn situation proved the strength of his moral courage and the wisdom of his message, or his measures. So, What we have here, and this is a painting at the museum that was done for them of the battle. Many occurrences serve to weaken my confidence, William said, in the correctness of a deistical principles. Remember, a deist says God made the world, but he doesn't intervene in the affairs of man. And so he goes on. I was led frequently to compare this country to that of the children of Israel, before whom God drove out the inhabitants of their land. He said the British were 14,000 strong. We being also successful at the battle at the same time in an engagement with the fleet on the lake. He says, his comments were this: at the commencement of the battle, we looked upon our own defeat as almost certain, yet we were victorious. So surprising a result against such odds did seem to me like the work of a mightier power than man. He was a deist, sold on the idea that God is not here. And yet he could not get out of his mind that God had intervened directly into the affairs of man. This changed his whole view about what was going on. That was the first domino that fell. This would lead him to consider God and the Bible, lead him to his conversion in 1816, lead him to his conclusions in 1818, that in about 25 years, the affairs of mankind would be wrapped up. That was the beginning of Adventism, right there, that moment. That's why we're here. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you so much that we are part of a movement you designed. You rose up just as surely as you raised up Martin Luther in the Reformation. Give us our marching orders that we might share this last message to the world before us as we prepare for Christ to come. My prayer in Jesus' name. Amen.